Today, the growth of the mega city and the allure of the skyscraper. Why do people choose to live and work in a crowded, congested, polluted metropolis? And when it comes to buildings, is bigger always better? I'm Martin Stanford. This is Inside. Welcome to Inside. Cities with more than 10 million inhabitants are called megacities. 20 years ago, there were just 10 megacities across the globe. By 2030, this is expected to rise to 41, according to the latest research by the United Nations. The growth in these massive conurbations is a reflection of the rapid pace of population shifting from rural to urban areas. Is it that people move to where the jobs are, where the opportunities exist to better their family lives? Or is it that we like living with others, millions of others? Insight's Ty Genwright explains.
Chinese New Year. The country's most important festival, when millions travel from city to country to be with their loved ones. Since the 1980s, the number of Chinese people living in cities soared from just a fifth to more than half today. And now this annual event is the biggest movement of people recorded on Earth. More than half the world's population lives in cities, and more of us are moving. The UN estimates that 2/3 of people will lead urban lives by the year 2050.
If you look at London, 6 years ago, I would be telling you that London was growing at the rate of one London borough every 5 years. Now I'm telling you it's every 3 years London grows. If you look at Turkey, since 1968, the population in urban areas has doubled. And now that 73% of the population there is in urban cities, that's replicated across the globe.
Some migrate out of choice. For some, it's necessity. Whatever the reason, this movement of people is giving birth to more so-called megacities. In 1990, London was one of 10 cities around the world that fell into the category of megacity, defined as a place with more than 10 million people. Well, since then, more than 20 other cities have swollen to join that league, most of them in the developing world. And the pattern of that growth continues to this day. From Paris to Tokyo and from Moscow to Beijing, most megacities are world capitals with which many of us are familiar. But some cities you might never have expected, at least 10, are forecast to break the 10 million barrier in the near future, posing questions about their preparedness to cope with bigger populations.
So what are the pitfalls if too many people move in without the proper plans being put in place?
Well, if you don't plan properly, i.e. if you don't think about the integration of transport, housing, jobs, what can happen with unplanned urbanisation is an increase in informal settlements or slums and people unable to get between their homes and their jobs, so congestion, etc. We know how to plan, we know how to avoid all these things, but it doesn't happen by accident.
Bad urban environments are more than just an eyesore or inconvenience. They're also bad for your health. Chinese and Indian cities are demonstrating what can happen when pollution is allowed to choke a city. Shanghai has the highest cancer mortality rate in the whole of China. And while some of us thrive on the bright lights and hustle bustle, living in close quarters with our neighbours has its drawbacks too.
Many of us might think that living in a big city could be bad for our mental health, but is there any evidence behind it?
Yes, there is. Quite a few studies in the UK, Europe and the US have found this difference between urban and rural areas, that there's a higher risk of depression and anxiety in people who live in cities.
So what are the reasons for it?
We don't really know, but I suppose most people find living in cities more stressful. There's often more people around, and there's experimental work, for example, in mice and rats and so forth, that just being in crowds can increase your levels of stress. But of course, countryside isn't just some uniform rural idyll. There are some areas of the countryside which are quite remote, and life might also be quite difficult.
The biggest cities are the places where humankind makes its greatest impact on planet Earth. They're growing at a pace never seen before, so it's important to get the planning right. Ty Genwright reporting for Insight above London.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by David Nicholson-Cole, who's the Assistant Professor of Architecture at the University of Nottingham. And here with me in our London studio is Vanessa Caston-Brotto, who is the Senior Lecturer in the Development Planning Unit at University College in London. Vanessa, let me start with you. Why do so many of us end up living in cities?
Well, this is a complex phenomenon which doesn't only depend on movements from rural areas to urban areas, but it also depends on the incredible growth of population that happens within cities themselves. And obviously we know that the urban population is growing and that urban population reproduces itself as well. But the reasons why people move from rural areas to urban areas would depend in each country and the different economic dynamics that shape cities.
And David, is it simple economics that's involved here, that people tend to go where the work is, and as a balance of probabilities, there's more work in a city than in a rural area?
Yes, the communication, TV, the internet and so on has made people aware of the possibilities of modern city life. I was in China 35 years ago and I was astonished at the advertising on TV for consumer appliances, even when the average income was only £16 a month for some people. But people recognise they can't all work in the country anymore, especially with agriculture becoming more efficient. And the only place to go to is to the city. And the first generation in a city often have a very tough time. They can't afford the rents and they live in very tiny conditions. I'm thinking about Hong Kong, which has always been an immigration city, where the first generation were quite contented to live in what's called cage housing, which means literally living in a bunk where all your possessions were stored on your bed and you shared a room with 16 people. But the second generation always did better. They did it because they suffered a few years like that, because they would eventually get onto a housing list and it would be better for their children and grandchildren. And that's how Hong Kong has become so successful.
Vanessa, when cities are trying to improve, to expand, or to make the facilities even better, finance is difficult to come by, but often it's channeled through national governments. So you have another layer of bureaucracy involved. There is a movement, isn't it, at a recent UN conference suggesting money should go straight to cities because they're actually the best people to organise their own affairs. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. And we had a Habitat 3 conference to plan the future of cities, and all the nations participated in Quito in October 2016. And the inauguration of that conference was also accompanied by the World Mayors Assembly, where they make this point, and mayors from all over the world explain how getting better access to finance would improve their possibilities to deal with urban challenges.
But they face a challenge, don't they, that often national governments don't want to cede that decision-making or that power to spend money directly to mayors or to city leaders.
I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a question of the relationship between local governments and different forms of regional and national organization. But local governments have struggled to actually draw their own resources of finance. So very often they have to be supported through transfers or through other mechanisms. And I think that's why the document that resulted from that conference, which is called the New Urban Agenda, makes a lot of emphasis on financing and on national urban strategies that can deliver this kind of financial mechanisms at the local level.
David Nicholson-Cole, is it inevitable that cities, because you tend to be building on a pre-existing structure, you rarely get the chance to start absolutely from a blank sheet of paper, but they inevitably ended up with segregated communities, either through nationalities or through economic power?
I don't think that's inevitable. In Singapore, They have an absolute rigorous government policy of not allowing tall buildings to become a ghetto of one nationality. They force, in social housing, they make sure that the Chinese, Malay, and Indian and other nationalities, those are the three biggest ones, are actually mixing together. But there are other points I was going to bring up, is that Britain had a programme of new towns in the 20th century, like Milton Keynes and Harlow, Letchworth, which were sort of rather polite middle-class attempts to decentralise London. But the big movement currently is back into city centres because people enjoy the facilities a city has got. Excellent shopping and closeness to work, but also the transport nightmare that people have if they commute a long way from out of city. London is, with the congestion charges, has made it really quite pleasant to be there as a pedestrian, whereas there are cities which still suffer terrible traffic congestion. But the bad thing here is the motor car, not the buildings. Often, if you actually pedestrianise a street by moving the cars, it suddenly becomes a wonderful environment. Think about New Street in Birmingham.
David, I was going to put that point to you because as our film identified, it's not very nice living in cities. You are more likely to contract a disease, you're more likely to be breathing in dirty or polluted air, and yet this movement into urban areas, as you've identified, is occurring. People are prepared to make that sacrifice, are they, for what they consider to be the upsides of living in the city?
Well, they are. They put the health of their future grandchildren ahead of their own health. In places like Hong Kong, which are incredibly dense, with often, in some places, up to 1,000 dwellings per hectare, there's a massive movement called urban ventilation now, which is that any new development, you have to submit an urban ventilation assessment to predict and model what effect your buildings will have on airflow through the building, through the area, the urban area around your building, not only light shading but also wind shading. And I've got students designing buildings in Hong Kong, and we're very conscious of this. We're designing breezeways through buildings to make sure that airflow is able to go through. The other thing is that parks and boulevards improve airflow because they're wide and they've got trees in them. And any new city planning must include lungs, green lungs, which air can move between. If you've got a place like Hyde Park, the air movement over it is different than it is over a dense part of London, and the same with Hong Kong. You've got the mountain, the sea and the city, and you do get air movement between them caused by the thermal differences, and the more air that can move, the better it is for fresh air ventilation.
It is quite literally allowing the city to breathe, isn't it? OK, David and Vanessa, thank you for the moment.
Yes.
Continue our conversation in just a moment on Insight. Next, we're going to consider about cities and why more of them are choosing to build skywards.